Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mackowski. Thanks so much for being with us today. And we've got a great roundtable of historians who are going to chat a little bit today about Ulysses S. Grant, Memoir, and Memory. And joining me today is Frank Varney, author of the new General Grant, let me get that in here, and the Verdict of History. Frank, thanks for being with us today.
My pleasure.
And my friend from out in the great city of St. Louis, Nick Sacco, the chief historian and chief curator at the Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site. Nick, thanks for being back with us on the Emerging Civil War podcast.
Thank you, Chris. My pleasure. Always a pleasure.
So, Nick has done quite a bit of writing for us at ECW about Grant and Memoir and Memory, and I thought he'd be a good person for us to chat with. I want to kind of use Frank's book as a little springboard for us to just chat. And Frank, this is actually the second book that you've written about Grant and kind of the way he's written history and how that has impacted the way we understand history. Give us a quick little 101 level summary of kind of your approach to this.
Well, I was rereading Grant's memoirs for a course I was developing at Cornell when I was a graduate instructor there. And I happened to notice something that had escaped me the first time, which was how he was rather negative about certain people. Sometimes he was outright unpleasant. Most often, however, he was simply more like a case of damning with faint praise, like he did with George H. Thomas and a few others. And it got me wondering, was Grant reflecting the common wisdom about these people, or was he shaping it? Because one of the things that can happen around the same time was one of those polls that comes out every few years rating the presidents. And Grant, as he historically had been up until very recently, was very near the bottom of that poll. And the comments that I kept reading were, he was a personally honest man, but a poor judge of people. And so he surrounded himself with crooks, basically. And I got to thinking, well, if President Grant was a poor judge of people, maybe General Grant was too. So maybe we should take what he said about these people with a grain of salt. So I decided to go back and take a look at a couple and just see if, were they as bad as Grant said? Now, this was for my doctoral dissertation. Long story short, I went back to college in my 40s and finished my graduate work in my 50s and started a new career. And my advisor, Joel Silby, said, you do realize that you may do all this research, spend a couple of years researching this and discover that Grant was absolutely right. And I said, I know that's certainly possible. I at the time had a very high opinion of Grant, actually. I said, would it still be a dissertation? He said, sure. He said, it probably won't be a book in that case, but it'll certainly be a dissertation. So I said, well, let me see what I find out. And one of the first people I looked at was William S. Rosecrans. Rosecrans, I was surprised to learn, was the only Union major general who did not have a statue anywhere. Now, there were a lot of Union major generals, and this guy was an Army commander. I mean, he in 5 major actions of the Civil War. So I decided to start with him. And I was surprised to discover, when I went back to primary sources and started looking at Rosecrans' performance at places like Stones River and Chickamauga and the Tullahoma campaign, Iuka, Corinth, that what other people who were there were saying about those actions often directly opposed what Grant said about them. And in fact, in a couple of cases, Grant, as at Iuka, Grant contradicted himself. He submitted a report of the Battle of Iuka, which in the first case, basically said Rosecrans did well. I'm paraphrasing, obviously, that the Confederate escape was not his fault, that he did what anybody would have done in those circumstances. Then a couple of weeks later, about 2-3 weeks later, Grant submitted a second report, and in which he was highly critical of Rosecrans. And then in his memoirs, it was even worse. The words like neglect and failure started to show up. So I decided, let's go back and take a look at this. And what I was seeing in the letters, journals, and after action reports of officers who were there was completely different than what Grant was saying. And I also noticed the fact that although Grant was getting credit for the victory at Iuka, for example, in fact, the column in which he was accompanying, Ord's column, suffered total casualties of 1 man wounded. All the fighting was done by Rosecrans' column. And according to the documentation in the OR, Rosecrans then launched a pursuit. And yet Grant in his memoirs claimed that Rosecrans failed in his part of the plan and that failed to pursue. Well, Grant himself was 8 miles away from the action and basically contributed nothing. There's a period of 40 hours in which there's not a single order that leaves Grant's headquarters over Grant's signature to Rosecrans. And yet Grant claimed in his memoirs he was directing the battle from his headquarters in Burnsville. Corinth is even more egregious. At the Battle of Corinth, Grant is 58 miles away in another state, while Rosecrans fights a Confederate army slightly larger than his own. And once again, Grant gets credit for a victory he had almost nothing to do with. He had about as much to do with as Henry Halleck had to do with Grant's victory at Fort Donelson. And yet Rosecrans is blamed for letting a larger Confederate army escape. Something seems seriously wrong here. So I expanded my search and started looking into other things. And I was very surprised to discover that a lot of what I thought I knew about the Civil War, and like I imagine you gentlemen as well, and a lot of us who were students of the Civil War, I started reading this stuff when I was a kid. I mean, I spent most of my life reading books about the Civil War. I thought I had a pretty good handle on what had happened. But what I realized was what is happening is historians seem to be repeating the same stories over and over. Now, that wasn't done with any malice or any intent to deceive. Just as though I thought I knew what had happened at Chickamauga, for example, these people assumed they did as well, because everything we picked up and read about it told us the same story, that Rosecrans issued a faulty order, that when the center and right of his army collapsed, he abandoned the field, abandoned his still fighting army, and fell apart, basically, went back to Chickamauga, and according to one supposed witness who actually didn't say it, was kneeling, weeping in front of his confessor. Problem is that witness never, as far as I can tell, never actually said that. Quite the contrary. But what was happening was that person A writes a book, and they use Grant's memoirs as a source. Person B writes a book and uses person A. C uses A and B. D uses A, B, and C. And the first thing you know, we pick up 5 different books on the Battle of Chickamauga, and they're all saying the same thing, so we assume that's what happened. Well, now, there was no malice, no intent to deceive. Nobody expects everybody to go back and double check every source. But I was looking at this through a different lens. I was wondering where these stories came from. And when I traced them back up the line, I kept coming back to Grant, that he was the source for a lot, the ultimate source for a lot of these history books. And this means we had I'd say a somewhat incorrect view of what happened on many of these fields.
Okay, so really kind of diving into the historiography and how it's influencing itself as it evolves.
Yeah.
Nick, let me ask you. You spent a lot of time with Grant on a personal level because you're at his home. Let's go back to that premise that Frank mentioned. He was personally honest, but had a tough time judging character. What's your assessment of that assumption that people have made, and how do you wrestle with that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and you are correct, Chris, that in my role here at U.S. Grant National Historic Site is really trying to examine who Grant was as a person and the characteristics that defined him. So I do end up finding myself talking and researching quite a bit more about his personal life and to an extent his political life as well. And so within those realms, I do think that we run into some similar patterns as Frank has suggested with the Civil War. So for example, here in St. Louis, there are times where, so for example, in early 1859, Grant got out of the farming business. So he was a farmer here at his father-in-law's property, the Whitehaven estate, from 1854 until early 1859. But then Grant moved to the city, and he decided he was going to become a rent collector. He was going to work with his cousin, Harry Boggs, and they were going to go into real estate with each other. And the stories that we get is that Grant would knock on the door and be looking for the dues that are owed to the company, and Grant would end up giving them money instead because he felt bad for them, and he felt bad about their sob stories about why they didn't have the money to for their rent payment. And so Grant finds himself really struggling financially. There's actually, we have in our records here, there was a lawsuit that someone had filed against Grant and his father-in-law for a loan that had not been paid. In the end, Grant was exonerated and his father-in-law was on the hook for the payment, but that loan had not been paid. So, I think Grant, he is a very trustworthy person. I think he's very naive when it comes to interacting with different people. And, I think he has a good heart for the most part, but I do think that he does find himself on the short end of the stick, so to speak. And obviously in 1884 with the Grant and Ward, the Wall Street investment banking firm in New York City, and putting too much trust in his business partner there as well. But, I will say too that I think Grant, if you were on his good side, he would defend you and he would stand up for you no matter what. And we can see characters like Orville Babcock that don't necessarily deserve that sort of defense from Grant with their actions. But I think Grant, if you got on his bad side, he was a good hater. I think he could be a good hater if you got on his bad side. And, and I can't speak to all of the specifics of, the Grant Rosecrans dynamic or other generals necessarily. But Rosecrans is somebody that Grant definitely hated on quite a bit. And I think that is demonstrated in Frank's book. And so I'll start with that, but I got more to say kind of about memory more broadly whenever we get to that.
Yeah. Well, no, I'll go right ahead, because I think that, for me, one of the real interesting kind of nuggets at the center of this is that he writes a memoir, which gives any writer basically the license to write whatever he or she wants to write about, because it's my experience. And that's a much different document than a piece of objective history. And a lot of people confuse those, I think, particularly when it comes to Grant.
Yeah. Everybody's going to be the hero of their own memoirs. That's human nature.
Right. Yeah. So, and Nick, talk a little bit about that, and then I'll ask Frank to comment on it as well.
Sure. Yeah. And so we talk about historiography a little bit. It is certainly safe to say that the past 30 years of Grant scholarship has been a tremendous change from what had been seen, the previous 120 or so years of writing about Grant. And for me, I think the scholarship that's come out in the past 30 years is varied widely in terms of its reliability and its accuracy, where some scholars like Brooks Simpson I think very highly of, and I think their scholarship is pretty dang good. Some other scholarship, maybe not so much. And for me, a particularly noteworthy example of our discussion here is Joan Waugh's biography of Grant, which I like. I think it's a great introduction.
I reviewed that for the Journal of Military History, actually, at their request.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, I think it was around 2009, 2010, when Dr. Waugh had her book published. And she has a section about Grant and the writing of the memoirs that I think is fairly strong. But and with all due respect, she makes an argument that Grant was playing the role of the historian in writing his memoirs, and I do not agree with that. I think it's worth us having this question as to whether a memoir or an autobiography can be a form of history in the same sense that a historian produces scholarship. The historian is mining a range of primary source documentation. They're looking at what other historians have said about those things, and they formulate an interpretation based on their understanding of the evidence and what other historians have said about that evidence. Whereas a memoir like Grant's is very inward looking. And Grant says at the very beginning, this is my reflection on what the war was about, my experiences. And I think when you're looking at an individual experience like that, I think that's really hard to elevate that to the level of a professional historian, or the same methods that a historian is using. And so I think that is one of the examples that for me kind of highlights what Frank's talking about, is that historians have sort of shared Grant's recollections and maybe to a certain extent have relied on them too much without looking at other sources. It's not always that Grant's wrong all the time or that his view isn't valid, but whether the historian is different from the autobiography because they're looking at what others are saying and comparing and contrasting those resources. And so to me, Grant is not a historian in writing his memoirs. He's talking about his personal individual experiences and his personal memories, but it's not a work of history. So that's kind of one thing that I would throw out there.
And I think one thing that obfuscates that further is, as he's working on his memoir, he does have fact checkers that are trying to kind of back things up and research this and that. So it sort of has this veneer of objectivity because they're fact checking, but that's still like they're checking his own facts. Frank, talk a little bit about that. And why has that become such a complicating problem for people who use Grant's memoirs as a historical document?
You may have heard of the classical historian Barry Strauss. Barry does military history. He was one of my graduate advisors. And in discussing this topic with me, he said, and he reminded me of something that I remind my students of all the time, but it seemed to have escaped me. We are looking at history from hindsight. We know that, and the Grant of 1862, who's surprised at Shiloh, but will go to his grave denying he was surprised, doesn't know he's going to become general-in-chief of the Union Army and is going to become two-term president of the United States. He's a struggling man who was kicked out of, basically drank his way out of the army before the war, has been a failure at multiple things, and is trying desperately to hang on to his job. So the Grant who treats people the way he treated them in 1862, 63, 64, there's a growth process going on here. He's not necessarily the same person. The problem is once you have taken a position on something as a public figure like Grant, it's very hard to go back later on for many people and say, okay, I was wrong or I was unfair. It's easier for a lot of people, and I've worked for people like this, and you probably have too. You've certainly known some of them, I'm sure. It's easier to say, it wasn't my fault. If something went wrong, it was one of my subordinates screwed up.
I have a 6-year-old who uses that argument all the time.
Yeah, exactly. But it's kind of tragic when it's a grown man who's doing this. And he took credit successfully for things other men accomplished, as at Iuka and Corinth and other instances. And he tried very hard to never really accept blame for anything. One of the things I've heard people say is, well, he took responsibility for Cold Harbor. Not really. If you read what he said, it's one of my great regrets is that the attack at Cold Harbor ever happened. Okay, that sounds like it sort of just happened. Would have been more honest of him to say, one of my great regrets is that I ordered the attack at Cold Harbor over the objections of Winfield Scott Hancock and Gouverneur Kemble Warren, who were both on the scene and told me not to make it. It's sort of the mistakes were made, Ted Kennedy defense, if you will. So part of the problem that we face with all of these is that we're looking at a man who knows he's coming down to the end of his life. I mean, Grant's a dying man writing his memoirs. It's easy to forgive a lot. I visited the Grant Cottage several times. I've spoken there twice. I did a radio show from there once. And the poignancy of those two chairs pushed together that he had to sleep sitting up in while he's struggling to finish his memoirs to get his family out of debt, it really, really touches you. So I really, in some sense, I still have a lot of respect for Grant. I just don't think he was always fair, and I don't think he was always honest. And I think that's really the root of the issue here.
Nick, as we look at the documentary trail, Frank lays it out in both of these books. What sort of assessment do you come away with as far as fairness and maybe reasons behind that?
Yeah, I think when studying memory, there's different levels of memories, or maybe even different levels of truth, so to speak. So on a very small level, we have sort of our personal truths, things that we hold, things that we believe. And that doesn't mean that they're objectively true, but they're things that we believe. And when Grant is writing his memoirs, and Chris, you're absolutely right. Fred Grant was working, his oldest son was working as a fact checker, and for a little while, Adam Badeau was helping, but then Grant and Badeau had a falling out before that was all finished. But, Grant, on a basic level, it's sort of his personal truth of what he believed to have occurred during the war. And then on a sort of a broader level, we have kind of this forensic truth, sort of the forensic evidence that we have. So, battlefield reports, newspaper articles, so on and so forth. And so when we're trying to square what comes out of an autobiography with that forensic truth, it is definitely safe to say that things are not always going to line up perfectly. I frequently tell visitors here about Ulysses' wife, Julia, because Julia was the first lady to write her own personal memoir. And in her memoirs, living here at Whitehaven, growing up here at this property that the Park Service manages now, this was a plantation. Julia's father at one point enslaved upwards of 30 African Americans. And in Julia's recollection in her memoirs, this was a really happy, wonderful place to be. The enslaved were treated like family. She uses that term in the memoirs. She, in her mind, her family, provided all the care that the enslaved would need. They had food, clothing, a place to stay. And overall, they were very happy and content with their lives here at the Whitehaven estate. Now, the enslaved people, we really don't have much in terms of documentary evidence from their perspective to reflect their personal truths. But it's probably safe to say that the personal truth of an enslaved person here is not the same personal truth that Julia Grant remembered about her time here at Whitehaven. And equally important, Julia's personal truth about how she perceived slavery's operation doesn't line up with a larger forensic truth and realities of what actually happened with the institution of slavery here in the United States. And so when I think about Grant, when we look at motivation, it can be very difficult for historians to sort of look at the motivations behind somebody's decisions. I think that's one of the most difficult things we can do. And with Grant, he is such an enigma at times. Why did Grant enslave a man named William Jones while he was here? Why did he free William Jones? It's hard to get into Grant's mindset to figure out what he's thinking. And with Grant, on a basic level, we can assume that this is his personal truth. This is his understanding of the war and the way it played out. There are times where it's an honest mistake. And Grant even said in the preface to his memoirs that mistakes would be made and there would be things that he would get wrong. But then there's probably times where, he's being a little dishonest. I think the Shiloh example is great. Pretty evident that Grant got caught flat-footed. He's 8 miles away from the attack at Pittsburgh Landing. He was not ready for that attack. And in his memoirs, he said he was. And, he's definitely fudging that for sure. So I think this gets to a larger question of how do we understand people's motivations for saying the things that they say, and it's easier said than done sometimes.
One of the things that I've always thought I've sort of given him a little leeway in that, it's okay if he doesn't like somebody, I think we all kind of run into that sort of thing. Yeah. And, sort of that was my assumption with Rosecrans. One of the things that I really respected, Frank, with your first book particularly was you mentioned that notion of unfairness, which is a little different than just not liking somebody. And you laid out a pretty good documentary trail for how you came to that conclusion. You took a lot of flack for that, for daring to call out the Marvel Man. Tell me a little bit about what it was like to kind of navigate some of that criticism.
There were times it could be frustrating because, as I'm sure everyone who's going to watch this podcast will agree, if somebody makes up their mind that they like or don't like another person, it often doesn't seem to matter how much proof you can offer. They're simply not going to change their perspective. And the more proof you offer, the angrier they get. And that could be frustrating at times. I teach a course at St. Michael's College on historical memory, the process of historical memory. And the very first line in the syllabus is, we do not remember the truth. What we remember becomes the truth. And one of the exercises we do in this course is I give students eyewitness accounts of multiple historical events, 5 or 6 accounts, maybe more in some cases, and say, okay, so now write a narrative of what happened. And they find it almost impossible to do because so many of the eyewitnesses contradict one another. or even contradict themselves in different interviews given at different times. So it can be very hard to piece these things together as to what was going on. And then trying to decide what someone's motivation was, that's even more difficult. This is why I think it's important to remember that we're dealing with human beings. These are not demigods. These are men and women in some cases trying to do the best they can. And in many cases, when people make mistakes, they are reluctant later on to admit it. So they search for scapegoats, they search for an out, or they simply deny the mistake. Dave Powell and I have both mentioned about Grant's response to the charge of the Army of the Cumberland at Chattanooga, at Missionary Ridge, how he later on claimed that, and all of the battles I fought, no battle followed my plan as closely as this one does. Except that that's obviously not true. There's multiple eyewitnesses who say Grant was very upset when he's standing on Orchard Knob, and who ordered those men up that hill? The implication was heads were going to roll if this attack didn't succeed. And yet later on, he goes back and takes credit for it, just as he refused to accept any blame for Shiloh. So it's difficult to parse out motivations. Now, as far as the response to it, yeah, there were some people who were quite unhappy. The majority of people I heard from, though, seemed to think I got it right and that I was fair. I mentioned before, I've spoken twice at the Grant Cottage and done a radio show from there. That's where Grant finished his memoirs and where he died. If they thought I'd been unfair, they would not have had me there, let alone had me back. There was even some talk at one point about me having some sort of unofficial tie with them as like a site historian, but at the time I was still teaching out west and it was just not practical to do. Another author, David Moore. Dave had a book on Rosecrans, completely independently of one another. We both come in many of the same conclusions at roughly the same time. We met at the dedication of the Rosecrans statue in Sunbury, Ohio. He does have a statue there now. My wife and I were present at the dedication, as were 41 Rosecrans descendants, some of whom had to be convinced to come because they were embarrassed to have their name associated with his. My wife and I were named honorary Rosecranses by some members of the family, which was really nice.
That explains why you look so rosy today.
But there were a few people who were unpleasant. The keyboard warriors, predominantly, the people who would never show up at an event or never log into a Zoom event. They would simply criticize later, and often criticize something like a typo in the footnotes or some such thing. So generally speaking, people were quite receptive and very pleasant. I've gotten very good responses to both books. I was very, very pleasantly surprised when Midwest Book Review proclaimed the second book a masterpiece. That's one of the nicest things I can imagine hearing. Most historians were very pleasant about it. Larry Daniel, I was trying to track down a source when I was still doing the research for book one. And I wrote Larry a letter. Email wasn't a big thing yet. And it went off to his publisher and I kind of forgot about it. And all of a sudden the phone rang one day and it was Larry. And we had a nice half-hour-long discussion about what I was working on. And I said with some hesitancy, there are places where I don't agree with you. He said, do you do it respectfully? Disagreement is respectful. I said, yeah. He said, you don't say anything nasty about my mother? I said, no, of course not. He said, then we're good. He said, disagreeing is how we advance the field. And for the most part, Vince Dooley, the famous Vince Dooley, told me I was doing God's work by setting the record straight. That was also very nice to hear.
Yeah.
One of the things that really surprised me was how many Army officers, lieutenant colonels, and generals either send me emails or cards or approach me in person and said, "You're absolutely, this is how it works. The Army still works the same way today." I can testify that the corporate world and the academic world do. There's a lot of deceit and a lot of dishonesty going on and a lot of politics. So I think it's just part of the human condition. And I think, again, the point I've always tried to make is not that Grant was an evil human being, it's that he was a human being. He was not someone who deserves any more than the rest of us to be put up on a pedestal.
I have to say, a few minutes ago, you name dropped Dave Powell, and then he parachuted into our Zoom call. I was trying to summon him. It worked. So, Dave, welcome. Thanks for popping in and helping us out here today.
I'm glad I could join you. Thank you.
We had just talked a little bit about Grant and whether he had been surprised or not at Shiloh. You heard Frank talk a little bit about his reaction to Chattanooga. Tell me a little bit about your thoughts about Grant and what we know from the historical record versus kind of how he wants us to remember the historical record.
Well, having recently done a book on Shiloh, I am firmly convinced that Grant was surprised at Shiloh. It's hard to say otherwise. The thing that strikes me most about Grant, and really about all of these Civil War general figures we're talking about, is that at some point General Grant becomes the corporate General Grant.
Yeah.
He has a coterie of people who are have a vested interest in protecting him. And that's true for a lot of Civil War generals. When George B. McClellan got relieved, a cadre of people lost their jobs or fell out of favor. And that's true for the people that we kind of defend as well. Rosecrans certainly had a publicity team, as it were. And so it's a natural human tendency, like Frank says, to protect the corporate interest. And they sort of rally around Grant, and much of the post-war stuff, I think that slips into Grant's head about Hooker at Lookout Mountain or Missionary Ridge, is largely fed by that coterie of people who are telling Grant, well, your plan was great, sir. It was followed to a T. William T. Sherman at Missionary, or speaks of the battles of Chattanooga, says the same thing. It was the best planned, best executed battle of the war.
Mm-hmm.
If those of us who have written about it know it's far from that. If anything, nothing that Grant planned worked. The things that he had no intention of doing or had no hand in planning, that's what worked.
Well, and that sort of suggests too, sort of some of the complicity that goes on, and that maybe sounds more sinister. But of course, Sherman wants to say what a beautifully planned battle Chattanooga was, because he pretty much fails in his part. So he's got to cover his own butt. So of course, he's then going to reinforce whatever story Grant's going to do. That's going to then help. It
becomes a circle the wagon thing, and I think any Civil War general, probably any general in any era that you approach, reminds me of a very famous line out of the Napoleonic era when people said of Napoleon would release these official bulletins after every battle explaining how brilliant it was and how successful it was, and the phrase in France became "to lie like a bulletin." And so the corporate line just becomes, it just evolves into existence, and vested interests are faced off against each other. And let's face it, the generals are in competition. They're in competition for resources. They're for attention, for rank, obviously. Only one man can climb to the top. There's a good dozen senior federal generals who would love to be in Grant's place, but only one will emerge in 1864.
It sounds very Highlander. There can be only one.
Yeah. And of course, they're also jockeying for post-war political position. I mean, look at how many of the presidents, post-war presidents, were Union officers
and candidates who ran for office who didn't make presidents.
Yeah, Hancock and others. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Nick, let me ask you for a second, because I want to go back to this idea that Dave talks about, becoming Grant the corporation, and very much central to what you guys do at your site is, Grant the person. And he does sort of become this entity, particularly by the time he's the president, and he and Sherman even have a strained relationship because Grant turns into this thing that even Sherman disapproves of. Tell me, how do you look at that transformation, and how do you deal with that on a daily basis?
Yeah, I think at least within the political realm, there's a lot of reluctance with Grant, but he sort of, it gets back to this question as to, do people shape events or do events shape people? When Grant first ran for office, there was Grant considered himself not a politician, but a statesman, somebody who looked out for the interest of the entire nation, as opposed to a mere trading politician that was only looking out for his best interest. And when Grant was asked about being a member of the Republican Party, he said he wasn't a member of a party, but the party chose him. But as his presidency continues, Grant starts sounding like a pretty good Republican. He starts embracing Republican talking points. And, he is, to a certain extent, he is following the party, but then to a certain extent, the party is following him as well. And I think Dave's comments for me sort of trigger this idea that we just have to remember that the personal memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant are, it's Ulysses S. Grant of 1885 and not the Ulysses S. Grant of the 1860s, because we look at, for example, Grant speaks very harshly of the Mexican-American War, and I would say very eloquently about why that war was wrong. Grant even goes so far as to say that he didn't have the heart to resign, but he gives this suggestion that it was actually something he thought about, because he just thought that this war was so wrong. If you go through the papers of Ulysses S. Grant, Volume 1, in the 1840s, I mean, he's just writing to Julia. He's talking about coming back to Whitehaven and spending time with her. There's no letter where he gets into this really deep philosophical meditation on the meaning of the Mexican-American War or any sort of discomfort about the war being fought. And so I think the Ulysses S. Grant of 1885 had come to believe that the Mexican-American War was sort of the consequence of the Civil War breaking out, and believing that this was a war that, in his words, it was a wicked war. But he may not have actually been at that point when he was actually fighting in the war. It sort of that sentiment matured over time. Likewise, Grant talks about slavery and how he says in his memoirs that slavery was at odds with the civilized world. But here he is in St. Louis in the 1850s living on a plantation. And he did not tell his father-in-law, hey, slavery is at odds with the civilized world. So I think sort of this corporate identity that Grant sort of establishes for himself is just, it's a product of what's going on around Grant, but it's also him thinking and reflecting and, having more wisdom in hindsight. He's able to look back at the Mexican-American War in hindsight and make a commentary on the unjustness of that war. And he wasn't necessarily in a position to do that when he was a participant in the war. So it sort of highlights sort of the challenges and advantages of being a participant in history versus being an observer of history.
Yeah, people forget, like at the time he's writing his memoirs or just before, one of his pet projects was a railroad through Mexico. I mean, he was deeply involved with the Mexican government at that point, and certainly very sympathetic to it. So that certainly would have colored his context. I love your comment about, the Grant of 1880s versus the Grant 1860s. And not only has he changed, his position of power has changed, his ability to influence things around him is significantly different. Frank, we haven't really touched too much specifically on your second book, but you present three really interesting case studies. Your first book really kind of looks at Rosecrans, but you have George Thomas, Gouverneur K. Warren, and Joe Hooker, each who, as personalities, we could talk about for days and days and days. They each present their own unique sets of challenges to any commander, and you really kind of do a nice job of looking at all three. Grant's, I would say, unfair to each of them in different ways, to kind of use your terminology. Tell me a little bit about why you came to these three guys and decided to, treat them in your second book.
I was just curious about Hooker, the fact that I'm actually writing an article. I was commissioned to write a 6,000-word article for a magazine, and I happened to write this today, that Joe Hooker is treated like three different men by a lot of historians. You have the competent, if somewhat annoying, division commander. You have the
an assessment I agree with.
Yeah. You have the rather unstable but still aggressive corps commander. And then you have the Army commander who loses his nerve at the worst possible time. Okay, those, I have a tendency to suspect that the same Joe Hooker is there for all three of these. He was, I think, aggressive to a fault, right? But I always just found Hooker interesting as a person. And our flower girl married a descendant of his, so that kind of got me interested in him as well. I was wondering how a very capable division commander could do such an apparently lousy job as an Army commander. And I was surprised when I really started digging into Chancellorsville. One thing I hadn't realized was that there had been an investigation by the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. And they had found that 4 things went wrong at Chancellorsville, and 3 of them were not at all his fault. The fourth one that they said was his fault was that the plan he had for the use of the cavalry was flawed. But they basically said that it was Oliver Otis Howard's failure to guard the right in spite of repeated warnings to do so. It was Sedgwick's half-hearted effort at best to come to Hooker's aid when he was summoned. And it was the fluky cannon shot that concussed Hooker, because he's leaning on a pillar of the Chancellor Mansion. Even Abner Doubleday, who didn't like Hooker, said that it was not, what happened at that point was not his fault. He was in a great deal of pain and he'd been injured. So I just found Hooker interesting, and I decided to take a look at his interaction with Grant, which was somewhat limited. But what I found interesting in Grant's memoirs, which is what kind of got me started on Hooker, was Grant's comment that he found Hooker dangerous to his superior officers because when in action, his tendency was to gather as many other officers and commands to him as he could and sort of exercised an independent command. And I got to wondering when this happened. Nobody seems to have commented on it in the early battles of the war in the East. You don't hear any complaints from Burnside, McClellan, anybody else that I've come across anyway. And at Chancellorsville, he's the Army commander, so obviously can't happen there. And Grant had relatively limited contact with Hooker at Chattanooga and then Sherman during the Atlanta campaign. And at the time, again, there doesn't seem any complaint being made about this. So where does it suddenly come from retroactively? Why does it appear in the memoirs that Hooker is dangerous in this regard? The only possible instance that I can find is Sherman claims that Hooker issued a command to Schofield. Okay, except that Schofield denied it. The one person you figure, okay, if he said it, Schofield is going to support Sherman there. Schofield said, no, he never approached anything like giving me an order. He sent me a message informing me what was going on. That's basically it. And Schofield was at one time one of the Grant men, although he, along with others, James H. Wilson and others, have a falling out with Grant after the war. So that's kind of why I got interested in Hooker. I was wondering where this charge came from, and I couldn't really find any specific instance of it, but there it is in Grant's memoirs. George H. Thomas, I mean, he's just a beloved figure. You know, you mention him at any Civil War roundtable or any online group, and you're going to hear some very nice things about him, and rightfully so. He appears to have been a very honorable man and a very competent commander. And yet the way he's treated by Grant after the war is really not very, very kind. When he requests an assignment in the East so he can be close to family, and instead he's given an assignment in California. And the Grant's criticisms in his memoirs, we used to laugh that General Thomas was too brave to run and too slow to attack. And again, who was complaining about this? Thomas served under Don Carlos Buell. Buell didn't complain about it. He served under Rosecrans. Rosecrans thought the world of Thomas. I didn't see any indication of it during Thomas's time under Grant or Sherman. Sherman sort of retroactively decides that it may have been the case after Grant said it. During the Atlanta campaign, Thomas and his men were where they were supposed to be when they were supposed to be there. It all seems to come back to the Battle of Nashville, when Grant and Sherman make a miscalculation. Sherman leaves with Thomas what he himself decides, what Sherman describes as the unfit and the useless. And he starts his campaign driving from Atlanta to the sea, to Savannah in the sea. And Hood doesn't do what Sherman expects him to do. He doesn't try to stop Sherman. He drives north. And suddenly Thomas is at the center of events, which is not where Grant or Sherman expected him to be. And if you read the message string from Grant to Thomas, Grant almost seems hysterical at the time. McFeely made the same comment in his writings, and Albert Castell did as well. And Thomas calmly gives what appear to be quite logical reasons for why he's trying to get everything together, trying to get his ducks in a row. And when he finally launches his attack, he does extremely well. But had he waited another day or two, he wouldn't have been able to, because Grant was in the process of replacing him. And one of the things that I think is important to remember here with Thomas, and it is with Rosecrans as well, is that the times that they're blamed for being seemingly slow to get things started, Rosecrans with Stones River campaign and later on with Tullahoma, Thomas here at Nashville, there's no negative consequences because of those seeming delays. When they launch their operations, they do so effectively. Thomas administers a very significant defeat to Hood. And yet, what do we hear? What do we come away with? Thomas was slow. As far as Warren, to me, that is one of the most tragic cases of the war. Warren gets on Grant's bad side, and I believe Grant set out to deliberately destroy him, and he did. The story we've been hearing for many, many years was that Warren was relieved because he inadvertently triggered Sheridan's fiery temper. I don't think that's the case. You know, and again, we don't have the time to go into it in any great depth here. It's a couple of chapters in the book, but Grant was angry with Warren before the Five Forks campaign ever started. And once again, Grant claiming retroactively he and Sheridan had a quote unquote secret plan to end the war, which is not borne out by anything in the records and doesn't make any sense when put into the context of what else is going on at that time. Warren is relieved from his command after contributing to a victory, the victory at Five Forks. He performs very well at Five Forks, yet he's relieved from command. Officers who were there, including Custer of Sheridan's command, said that at the climactic attack, Warren was leading the attack of his corps, his colors in hand, leading his men over the breastworks. And yet, when he sends an aide to Sheridan for further orders, he's told, tell General Warren, by God, he was not in the fight. And he's relieved from command. And he should have, by Army regulations, had a court of inquiry within 30 days. Took him almost 18 years to get one. And it was only because of an intervention by Rutherford B. Hayes, who himself wasn't a big fan of Grant. And Warren was acquitted of all charges. And consider the courage it took for those officers, that court-martial, to do that. These are all active duty officers. And they are making a decision that obviously flies in the face of what Grant wants, former President Grant, of what Sherman wants, General-in-Chief of the Army, and what Sheridan wants, who everybody knows is going to be the next General-in-Chief of the Army. But Warren never knows, because Sherman withholds the findings until after Warren's death of diabetes, complications of diabetes. Warren says, I die a disgraced soldier and is buried with no military honors. I think it's one of the great tragedies of the war. A man who served his country capably and well, believed he died as a disgraced soldier. And I think Sheridan regretted it too. He could never come out and say so because he owed too much to Grant, but there are indications.
And I've always, that's a great example of Grant backing his buddy instead of maybe doing what he should have. I'm one of those folks who thought that Warren received a terrible injustice at Five Forks. Should have been fired a lot earlier, but he certainly didn't deserve.
There are other instances he could have been for, yes.
Dave, what's your assessment of all that as our military historian here?
Well, currently I'm writing about the Atlanta campaign, which is also the first annual reunion of the Chancellorsville Losers Society. It's got Hooker, it's got Stoneman, it's got who is the cavalry chief.
I'm looking right out my window right now at those guys.
Yeah, and so Chancellorsville, and it begins, the campaign arguably begins about May 1st, just about the time a year ago when things were going so badly for Howard and Hooker. I think a lot of Grant's animosity comes secondhand from Sherman towards Hooker, I mean.
Yeah.
Because Hooker was while they had a pre-war relationship that wasn't good, Hooker defaulted on a couple of bank loans to Sherman. Sherman's bank collapsed, I'm sure in part because of those loans. And Hooker was exactly the kind of guy to annoy Sherman and Grant both. He was kind of bombastic and press happy, he had a following, and yet Frank was talking about the three Hookers. There's actually a fourth Joe Hooker, the post-Chancellorsville highly competent corps commander in the Atlanta campaign.
Yeah.
Which even Hooker's own biographer covers very scantily, very skimpily.
Let me pause you just for a second, because of the view we have on Zoom right now. You mentioned the highly competent Corps Commander Hooker, and all of my folks in Hollywood Squares were nodding their heads. And I just got to point that out, because most people don't make that association with Hooker, but we've got pretty good consensus on that here. Go ahead.
It's I think because for a long time the conceived wisdom of history was that Hooker was washed up after Chancellorsville and didn't really do anything. Of course, he went west, and that's where you always send your losers to go, Minnesota or wherever we send them. I think Thomas's case is equally interesting. Sherman has a role in that too. Sherman has a very distinct sort of good guy, bad guy relationship with Thomas. He undercuts, during the campaign, he undercuts Thomas quite a bit to Grant in sort of personal communication and privileged military dispatches. And it's kind of asides. One of the things that Sherman is good for is to throw out sort of reckless comments. He's one of those people without a filter, as we say today. And so those comments get preserved and they suddenly become posterity. But Frank is right. Thomas is very professional and very capable in the Atlanta campaign. It's Thomas's Army of the Cumberland that wins the day at Chattanooga by storming Missionary Ridge. That reverses a day of failure. And I won't comment so much on Warren, because I have a popular understanding of Five Forks and Warren's relationship with Grant and Meade. And I sort of agree with the group that there are times when Warren maybe should have gotten fired, or maybe wasn't fully committed to Meade and Grant's vision, but not at Five Forks. It strikes me that he did turned in a competent performance at Five Forks. Well, I think
I'm sorry, David, I didn't realize.
Well, I was just going to say that the larger problem is really not about. Well, there are two sides to this coin. One is that commanding generals get to build their team. They create military teams. Any organization is not just a wire diagram or a set of flowcharts. You have to build relationships and consensus. Effective armies work well because their leaders work well together. So team building is important, and generals like Grant and Sherman do get to choose their team. Arguably, they don't always choose the best people. They choose the people they like the best. And so that means that men like Hooker, who's a highly competent soldier, really under other circumstances could easily have been the man to replace Grant had Grant got sacked at Shiloh and Hooker not lost it at Chancellorsville. Things could easily be reversed. They're both competent people, but the passage of time has meant those guys that fall by the wayside don't necessarily get recognized for their military talents. We remember them as personalities, often difficult personalities, but not whether or not they're competent soldiers.
Yeah, Hooker's a great example of that, where he's remembered as a caricature because of Chancellorsville, not because of all these other things. So let me head into our final round here. And Nick, let me ask you. Frank has done a really good job in his two books here of laying out this evidentiary trail of breadcrumbs that we can follow. And yet people will still go back to Grant and look at his memoirs and say, like, this is the final word. He's the guy who won the war. He was president. How do you, as someone who deals with the memoirs all the time and Grant all the time, how do you reconcile those two different perspectives?
Yeah, I think Frank has demonstrated in our meeting here that Grant was a human, that made plenty of mistakes and had plenty of his own personal flaws, and those have to be kept in context as well. But there's probably two things that I would highlight. One is that we are very fortunate to have 32 volumes of Grant's papers, and the papers provide additional evidence that goes beyond just the memoirs. And so going back to our earlier comments, we can see what Grant was saying in real time as well. And I think that's a useful exercise, is to, if we compare what Grant is saying in 1885 versus what he's saying in real time during these various battles, I think that might provide a clue that, the memoirs at certain points definitely need to take it with a grain of salt. Something else that sticks out to me, though, is that Grant, when he was on his world tour, 2.5-year world tour from 1877 to 79, he said multiple times during the world tour that basically things could have played out very differently, and there could have been any other number of men that took his role and his position and would have had success as well. And he kind of says that it just sort of worked out the way where I ended up being the top commanding general. He told Otto von Bismarck that he said he never read military history, and he said he considered himself more of a farmer than a soldier, to Otto von Bismarck. So I think, for Grant, it's probably a universal thing. Just autobiography in general can be very useful to understand somebody's personal truths and their personal insights, but it's not enough if we want that real comprehensive historical understanding. We just have to find a way to compare the autobiography with some of the other documentary evidence that's in play. And, again, Shiloh is a great example of those two things not lining up. And that's what I try to tell visitors, is the memoirs, they've never been out of print. And they've never been out of print, partly because they're very well written. We got to keep that in mind too. Like, Grant is an excellent spokesman for himself as well. And that contributes to the dominance of his memories within the larger social memories of the Civil War at the time, is that, it was a good read. People liked reading it as well. But it's not the last word. And I think that's important for us to remember, is that Grant is just one voice. It is not the voice or the last voice to have a say in what happened during the war.
Mentioning Shiloh again sort of makes me think of maybe the exception that proves the rule, where he does add that note to his memoirs, reconsidering Lew Wallace. And material has come to my attention since I wrote this, or since I did my report, that has made me reconsider that. And that's definitely an exception, as opposed to the rule where he does sort of correct the record. Dave,
yes,
let me
and real quick, Chris, I'll say too, there was people who loved John Rawlins and didn't like the memoirs because they believed that Grant didn't give Rawlins enough credit in his memoirs either. So there's a lot of different angles with it, for sure.
Yeah, great. Dave, final thoughts about Grant, Memoir, and Memory?
Well, I would never tell people not to read Grant's memoirs. They're a great book. It's really a good piece of writing. But just like any Civil War or any historical experience, we go well beyond the Civil War. It's not the complete story. It will never be the complete story. But Nick is absolutely right. We do have 32 volumes of Grant papers to sort of fact check him on. And if only other important historical figures had 32 volumes worth of papers to dig through, George Thomas for one. But I don't see the memoirs as either extraordinarily truthful or extraordinarily mendacious. I think they fall into the category that virtually all the memoirs, the published memoirs, do. Albert Castell once famously called Sherman's memoir "Prevaricating Through Georgia." If you read John Scofield's memoir, which I've been immersed in lately, you get very much a lot of backbiting and criticism. I could have done it better, sort of implied. So the memoir is a class of literature and a class of history that we need and rely on, but it's an aged primary source. It's not as fresh as that letter or that telegram that was dashed off the morning of the event or something.
Right. Frank, let me give you the last word. Thoughts as we wrap up our conversation?
First of all, in relation to the memoir, the problem is not the memoir itself, I don't think. As we all seem to agree, it is very well written, it is very entertaining. The problem is that it has been afforded too much weight. We've treated it, as Nick and Dave and you have said, like an historical document. In a sense, it is. It's a long after the fact historical document. It's someone's musings on events that took place decades before. Other thing too, as a professor, I get often asked by students, if you had a time machine and you could go back, what would you want to see? And I'd like to see the Gettysburg Address. I'd like to go to Dallas on November 22nd, 1963, if there's anybody on that damn grassy knoll. And another time I'd like to go back to is George Thomas's funeral. He's buried in Troy, New York, about 2.5 hours south of where I am right now. On the day of his funeral, among the attendants were Ulysses S. Grant, William Tecumseh Sherman, William S. Rosecrans, Joe Hooker, and Gouverneur Kemble Warren. I bet the tensions are running pretty high that day. I'd love to be a fly on that wall. Anyway, I appreciate you doing this, getting this group together, these distinguished gentlemen. And I'd like people to just come away with this, understanding that Grant was a human being like everybody else. And like all the rest of us, he had his flaws. He had good points and he had bad points. And the problem, as I've said before, is not in his memoirs themselves. It's in our willingness to accept them as fact.
And for the record, I'll just flat out say I'm a big Grant fan. Love the guy. And but I also think we do him an injustice when we forget that he's a human being. And when people go too far to the hagiography or too far into the just outright criticism, we lose that humanity that falls in the middle. And so conversations like this to me are really enlightening because they help us see ways that we can see him as being a human being. So I appreciate Frank, Nick, Dave, I appreciate your comments today. This has been a great conversation, exactly what I was hoping for. So the latest book from Frank is General Grant and the Verdict of History, Memoir, Memory, and the Civil War. His first book is Ulysses S. Grant and the Rewriting of History, both available from Savas Beatty. Thank you all for being with us. I'm Chris Mackowski. We will see you online and on the battlefield.